The wind in Red Willow, Montana, had a way of speaking. In autumn, it didn't whisper. It scoured the valley floor, carrying the grit of a long, dry summer and the bone-deep promise of a winter that would forgive nothing. It swept down from the jagged teeth of the Bridger Mountains, turning the grass to the brittle color of old gold and chasing the last of the warmth from the sun. The town itself was little more than a single dirt street, a scar of civilization drawn between the vastness of the earth and the endless bowl of the sky. A wooden church pointed a defiant steeple toward heaven, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Across from it stood the marshal's office, a squat building with a barred window that seemed to squint at the goings-on of the town. Farther down, past the blacksmith's forge that rang with the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel, was the Sunflower Saloon. And beyond it all, nestled in the folds of the foothills, lay the Thatcher Spur Ranch, a sprawling legacy of cattle and dust. The cold came early that year of 1887. A premature frost had silvered the edges of the horse troughs, and the water drawn from the town well carried a thin crust of ice each morning. The world felt hard, its edges sharpened by the coming chill. In the distance, the lonesome cry of a train whistle echoed through the valley, a sound that spoke of a world moving faster than Red Willow, a world of iron and money that was steadily encroaching on this quiet pocket of endurance. Inside the Sunflower Saloon, the air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. It was a man's world, loud and coarse, but behind the long pine bar stood Lila Hart, an island of quiet diligence in a sea of rough talk. At 19, she had the kind of simple, unadorned beauty that men often overlooked in their search for the painted finery of women like Pearl Malloy, who sang from the saloon's small stage in the evenings. Lila's hair was the color of meadow hay, pinned back neatly, and her eyes were a soft, steady gray, the color of a dove's wing. She moved with a practiced economy, her hands never still as she wiped down the counter, poured whiskey into thick glasses, and made careful notations in a leather-bound ledger. She was the daughter of a farmer whose luck had run out 2 seasons prior, leaving him with nothing but a patch of soured earth and a quiet grief that had settled into his bones. The church had given Lila her letters and numbers, but life had given her this job. Mr. Hardin, the saloon's weary owner, had hired her for the day shifts with a strict understanding she poured drinks and kept the books. Nothing more. She was a fixture, as reliable and unassuming as the brass rail that ran the length of the bar. This quiet dignity was her shield. She knew the whispers that followed her, the assumptions made about a girl who worked in such a place. She was still a virgin, a fact she guarded not out of naivete, but out of a fierce, unspoken desire to be the sole author of her own life. She feared the careless judgment of the world far more than she craved the clumsy touch of any man she had yet met. Across the room, Pearl Malloy watched Lila from her table, her painted lips curved into a faint sneer. Pearl's voice was her fortune, a smoky instrument that could coax coins from the pockets of lonely cattlemen. But she saw in Lila's quiet reserve a judgment that pricked at her own hard-won place in the world. She saw the men's eyes sometimes soften when they spoke to Lila, a flicker of respect they never showed her, and she hated her for it. Coulter Graham was a man made of the same silence that defined the vast Montana landscape. At 32, he was the eldest son of the Thatcher Spur, and the weight of the ranch rested on his broad shoulders like a second skin. He was a master horseman, his movements in the saddle as natural and fluid as a hawk's glide on an updraft. He spoke little, preferring to let his actions carry the weight of his intentions. He showed his care for his men not with easy words but with a mended harness, an extra blanket left on a bunk, or a shared swallow of coffee against the biting morning cold. The ranch was drowning in debt, a slow tide of numbers and figures that threatened to pull the Thatcher legacy under, and the burden had carved fine lines around his steady, watchful eyes. That afternoon, he had ridden into town for supplies, his horse leaving soft puffs of dust in its wake. He tied the reins to the hitching post outside the general store and was walking back when a burst of raucous laughter erupted from the Sunflower Saloon. It was a familiar sound, the usual blend of drink and desperation. He paid it no mind, continuing on his way, until a different sound reached him, faint and unexpected. It was a melody. A simple folk tune hummed low and soft, almost a prayer. It was a thread of pure, clean sound in the saloon's grimy tapestry of noise. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, made him stop. He moved to the side of the building, standing in the narrow alley where he could see through the grimy window without being seen. Inside, a trio of drovers, their wages nearly spent, had grown loud and belligerent. They were arguing over a card game, their voices rising with each swallow of whiskey. And behind the bar, Lila Hart was humming. She did not look at them, her focus seemingly on polishing an already clean glass. But the tune flowed from her, a gentle current meant to soothe the rising tide of anger. It was a song his own mother used to sing, a simple lullaby about a river flowing home to the sea. The drovers seemed to sway to it, their argument losing its sharp edge, the tension in their shoulders easing as the simple melody worked its quiet magic. Coulter watched her for a long moment. He saw not a saloon girl, but a young woman trying to hold back the chaos with the only tool she had, a sliver of peace. He had seen her 100 times, a quiet face in a loud room. But today, he had heard her. Without thinking, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn notebook and a stub of a pencil. He tore a blank page free and, bracing it against the rough wood of the saloon wall, wrote 5 simple words. He folded the paper carefully, walked back to the front of the building, and slipped it onto the dusty exterior windowsill. Just beneath the window she stood behind. Then he mounted his horse and rode out of town, the quiet melody following him long after he had left the dusty street behind. The ride back to the Thatcher Spur was a familiar comfort. The creak of the saddle leather, the steady rhythm of his horse's gait, the vast, empty beauty of the land. This was the world he understood. But as he rode, his thoughts were not on the price of beef or the coming winter. They were on that sliver of a song. When he arrived at the ranch, the sight of a well-maintained but visibly aging barn and the lean frames of the cattle in the paddock brought the familiar weight of responsibility crashing back down. He was not in the yard for more than 5 minutes when a buggy pulled up, a stark black intrusion against the rustic browns and golds of the ranch. Silas Kincaid stepped out, a man whose polished boots seemed to insult the dusty ground. Kincaid represented the bank and the railroad, 2 powerful forces that were squeezing the life out of small ranchers like the Grahams. He was dressed in a fine city suit, a smile fixed on his face that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Lounging in the buggy's passenger seat, looking bored, was Marshall Pike, the town's lawman. His presence was a silent statement of where the power in Red Willow truly lay. "Graham," Kincaid said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A word." Coulter simply nodded, his face an unreadable mask, and waited. "Business is business," Kincaid began, taking a document from his coat pocket. "The bank has reviewed your loan, given the current market and the railroad's expansion plans. The interest rate is being adjusted. It is a necessary measure. I'm sure you understand." Coulter took the paper. He did not need to read the fine print. He could feel the trap closing. How much, he asked, his voice low and steady. Kincaid's smile widened. "A modest increase. One you should be able to handle, provided you have a profitable season." He knew, and Coulter knew he knew, that 3 straight years of drought had made a profitable season an impossibility. It was not a loan adjustment. It was a death sentence for the ranch. Marshall Pike shifted in his seat, his hand casually resting on the butt of his pistol. The message was clear. This was not a negotiation. "You're squeezing us out, Kincaid," Coulter stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I am simply managing assets," Kincaid replied smoothly. "This valley is changing. Graham, Progress is coming. You either get on the train or you get run over by it." He gestured for the paperback, and after a moment, Coulter handed it to him. Kincaid folded it neatly and returned to his buggy. "You have until the spring roundup to make the first new payment," he said over his shoulder. "I trust you will be prompt." The buggy turned and rolled away, leaving Coulter standing alone in the yard, the dust settling around his boots. Later that evening, the Sunflower Saloon was quiet. The day's customers had drifted away, leaving behind the lingering smell of their presence. Lila finished wiping down the last of the glasses, her movement slow with fatigue. Mr. Hardin, his face etched with worry, was counting the day's meager earnings. "We need more customers." "Lila," he said, not looking at her. "Steady ones, men with money to spend." He paused, then added, "Mr. Kincaid was in earlier. Mentioned he enjoys the atmosphere in here. We need to make sure men like him feel welcome." The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. He wanted her to be more than just a girl who poured whiskey. He needed her to be bait, and the thought made a cold knot form in her stomach. She said nothing, merely nodding as she untied her apron. She climbed the narrow stairs to her small, plain room above the saloon. It was her sanctuary, the one place where she could breathe. As she went to close her window against the cold night air, her fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper on the sill. Frowning, she picked it up. It was rough paper, torn from a notebook. She unfolded it. Inside, written in a strong, simple hand, were 5 words. "I didn't know saloons could pray." Lila stood there for a long time. The paper held loosely in her hand, she read the words again and again. In a world that saw her as one thing, the saloon girl, someone had looked through a dirty window and seen something else entirely. They had heard her. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost brought tears to her eyes. She did not know who had left it, but in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of her life, this small, anonymous note felt like a seed of hope. From the distance, the train whistle blew again, a lonely cry in the vast, gathering darkness. But for the first time in a very long time, Lila Hart did not feel entirely alone. The small, folded note became a secret talisman for Lila. She kept it tucked into the worn cover of her late mother's book of Psalms. Its 5 simple words, a silent counterpoint to the loud, demanding world she inhabited each day. She did not know who had written it, but the mystery was part of its power. It was a kindness that asked for nothing in return, a flicker of light from an unknown source. A few days later, she was leaving the saloon after her shift, her shoulders aching from a long day of lifting heavy tankards. The rickety wooden steps out the back door had always been a hazard. One of the top planks rotted through and threatening to give way. She had learned to step over it, a small, unconscious adjustment in her daily routine. But tonight, as she stepped out into the crisp, cold air, her foot landed solidly. She stopped, looking down. The rotted plank was gone, replaced by a piece of new, pale pine, its fresh scent a clean note in the musty alley. There were new nails, hammered in deep and true. It was a small, practical repair, unnoticed by anyone but her, a quiet sort of magic. The chill in the mornings grew sharper, the wind carrying the first hints of snow. The small stove in the saloon struggled to chase away the damp, and the woodpile out back was a sorry collection of damp, mossy logs. One morning, Lila arrived before dawn to find a neat stack of dry, split pine waiting by the back door. It was not a large amount, just enough for a day's worth of steady, clean burning fire. It had been left without a word, a silent offering against the cold. Lila carried the wood inside, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and unease. These acts of service were like gentle ghosts, their presence felt but their source unseen. She felt seen, truly seen, but also vulnerable, as if she were being placed in a debt she could never repay. The feeling intensified a week later when a sudden autumn squall caught her on a rare walk to the edge of town. The rain came down in hard, slanting sheets, turning the dirt street to a thick, clinging mud. By the time she made it back to the saloon, she was soaked through, her thin dress clinging to her skin and her only pair of sturdy boots caked in mud and filled with icy water. She spent the evening in misery, her feet numb with cold, before she went up to her room. She cleaned the boots as best she could and left them by the cold stove, knowing they would be stiff and unforgiving in the morning. But when she came downstairs in the pale, pre-dawn light, the boots were not where she had left them. They were sitting on the hearth, and a faint warmth radiated from them. She touched the leather. It was dry and supple. Peering inside, she found them stuffed with clean, wadded scraps of cotton cloth, put there to absorb the last of the moisture and help the leather hold its shape. This was different from the steps or the firewood. This was an intimate kindness, an answer to a personal misery no one had even witnessed. A blush rose in her cheeks, hot and sudden. Someone was watching over her with a quiet, unnerving attentiveness. The whispers began in the saloon, as whispers always do. They started not with malice, but with the casual, boisterous speculation of the Thatcher Spur ranch hands. One of them, a young man named Billy, leaned over the bar as Lila poured him a beer. "You've got a secret admirer, Miss Hart," he said with a broad wink. "Someone's been leaving dry kindling at our line shack up in the north pasture, too. Seems we've got an angel in the valley." Another hand chimed in. "It's the boss. Has to be. Coulter's always fixing things no one else has noticed are broken." He looked at Lila, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "He's been riding into town more than usual, and he's a quiet man. That's how he shows his favor." Lila's face remained impassive, but her heart gave a sudden, hard thump. Coulter Graham, the quiet rancher with the steady eyes, the man who sat at the end of the bar and nursed a single whiskey for an hour, watching everything and saying nothing. Could it be him? The memory of the note, its strong, simple script, flashed in her mind. She said nothing, offering only a polite, non-committal smile. But her silence was a blank canvas onto which others could paint their own assumptions. The talk among the ranch hands was good-natured, a mix of teasing and genuine respect for their boss. But when the words reached Pearl Malloy's ears, they curdled into something ugly. One afternoon, Silas Kincaid sat at a corner table with Pearl, a proprietary hand resting on her arm. Pearl laughed at something he said, a sharp, practiced sound. Then let her gaze drift over to Lila, who was carefully wiping down the counter. "It is amusing, isn't it?" Pearl said, her voice carrying across the room. "How quickly a little charity can be mistaken for affection. A girl who works in a place like this, thinking she can catch the eye of a Graham." She took a delicate sip of her wine. "Some people should learn to be grateful for what they are given, without reaching for what is not theirs." Kincaid chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "The Grahams have more to worry about than saloon girls. My dear, their time in this valley is coming to an end." The words were meant for Lila to hear, and they hit their mark. They were barbs of shame, meant to put her back in her place. A conflict bloomed inside her, a painful tug-of-war between her own feelings of inadequacy and a stubborn sprout of self-worth that refused to be trampled. Part of her believed them. What was she but a farmer's daughter, pouring whiskey for a living? What right did she have to the quiet kindness of a man like Coulter Graham? It felt presumptuous, foolish. She was a charity case, a stray taken pity on. But another part of her, the part that had held on to that anonymous note like a prayer, rebelled. The kindness had felt genuine. Not like pity, it had felt like respect. The conflict left her feeling raw and exposed. She retreated further into her shell of quiet competence, her movements precise, her face a careful mask. She feared that to acknowledge the gifts would be to accept the label of a woman who was being kept, but to ignore them felt like an act of profound ingratitude. The tension in the saloon was high that evening. A group of railroad workers, flush with their pay, had been drinking since noon. Their laughter was too loud. Their arguments too sharp. One of them, a big man with a red sweating face, slammed his fist on the bar, demanding another bottle. "Mister." Hardin wrung his hands, his face pale with worry. Lila saw the situation fraying at the edges, about to tear into open violence. Without a thought, she began to hum. It was the same simple folk tune she had hummed before, a melody of quiet streams and rolling hills. She kept her eyes downcast, polishing a glass that was already gleaming. The melody was barely audible above the din, but it was there, a steady, calming presence. The big man paused, his fist still on the bar. He looked at her, his drunken gaze momentarily confused. The anger in his face softened, replaced by a sort of bewildered melancholy. He slowly lowered himself back onto his stool. The fight had gone out of him, deflated by a simple song. A few minutes later, the saloon door opened and Coulter Graham stepped inside. The room seemed to grow quieter just by his presence. He moved with an unhurried grace that commanded respect without demanding it. He walked to the end of the bar and nodded to her. "Whiskey," was all he said. Lila poured the drink, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Their fingers brushed as he took the glass, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. He drank half the whiskey in one slow swallow, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the railroad workers, now subdued and morose. He saw Mr. Hardin's relieved expression, and he saw her. He finished his drink and placed a coin on the bar, but he did not leave. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn canvas coat and pulled out a small object. He placed it on the polished wood of the countertop. It was a small notebook, bound in soft, unmarked leather, with a leather tie to keep it closed. It was empty. Lila stared at it, her heart pounding against her ribs. Coulter's gaze met hers. His eyes were the color of the Montana sky just before a storm, deep and serious. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "If you wrote down the things you hum," he said softly, "the world would know you do more than just pour whiskey." He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that was more powerful than any shouted declaration. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the empty book on the bar. It was not a gift of charity. It was a statement of faith. It was an invitation for her to find a voice the world could not ignore. And as Lila reached out and touched the soft leather, she felt the frayed ends of a quiet connection being tied into a firm, unbreakable knot. The small leather notebook became Lila's anchor. In the quiet hours before the saloon opened, she would sit in her small room and fill its pages, not with songs, but with observations. She wrote about the way the light fell across the valley in the morning, the weary faces of the cattlemen, the taste of the first snow in the air. The act of writing gave shape to her thoughts, a quiet rebellion against a world that had tried to define her with a single, limiting label. The autumn roundup at the Thatcher Spur was a time of controlled chaos, the air filled with the lowing of cattle, the shouts of men, and the constant thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. The ranch cook, a grizzled man named Jebediah with flour permanently embedded in his eyebrows, was overwhelmed. He was expected to feed 24 extra hands from sunup to sundown, and his temper was fraying as quickly as the hem of his apron. It was Coulter who came to the saloon one afternoon, his presence a quiet interruption to the midday lull. He approached the bar directly, his hat in his hands. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and formal. "Jebediah is about to start throwing cast-iron pans at the men. His books are a disaster, and he cannot keep track of the stores. We would be in your debt if you would consider coming out to the ranch for the next 2 weeks to manage the kitchen ledgers. We can pay you double what Mr. Hardin does." The offer was a lifeline thrown from an unexpected shore. It was a chance to escape the stale air of the saloon, the leering eyes of the customers, and Pearl's poisonous whispers. But more than that, it was an act of trust. He was not offering charity. He was offering a job, one that respected her skills. "I would be glad to help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But her gaze was steady and clear. Life at the Thatcher Spur was a revelation. It was a world of hard, purposeful work under an endless sky. She was given a small, clean room off the main ranch house, and she spent her days in a tiny office adjacent to the bustling kitchen. Her task was to tally the inventory, account for the supplies brought in from town, and ensure the vast quantities of flour, salt pork, beans, and coffee were properly recorded. For the first week, she worked with the ranch's own records, Jebediah's sprawling, messy accounts that he kept on scraps of paper. They were chaotic but honest. On the 8th day, Coulter brought her a formal ledger from the main house. "This is from Kincaid's bank," he said, his jaw tight. "It's their record of the supplies they've fronted us against our loan. See if it matches Jebediah's tallies." Lila spent the day bent over the 2 sets of books. The bank's ledger was neat, its columns of figures precise and elegant. Jebediah's notes were a disaster of smudges and hasty calculations. But as she began the slow, painstaking work of cross-referencing the entries, a cold feeling began to creep up her spine. A delivery of 10 sacks of flour on Jebediah's list was recorded as 15 in the bank's ledger. A shipment of salted beef was inflated by 100 pounds, crate by crate, barrel by barrel. The numbers were wrong. Kincaid was not just charging them ruinous interest. He was systematically billing them for goods they had never received, burying them deeper in a fraudulent debt. There were 2 sets of books because there were 2 realities, the one the Thatcher Spur lived, and the one Kincaid was creating to destroy them. The coldness in her gut turned to ice. This was not business. It was theft on a grand scale, a slow, methodical strangling. That Saturday, Lila rode into town with one of the ranch hands for personal supplies. As she stepped into the general store, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival, she saw Pearl Malloy standing by the counter, talking to the proprietor's wife. Pearl turned, and her eyes, bright and hard as polished stones, landed on Lila. A slow, malicious smile spread across her face. "Well, look what the wind blew in from the high country," Pearl said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the small store to hear. "I suppose the air in a saloon is no longer good enough for some. It seems the Thatcher Spur has a new prize heifer in its pasture." The other customers in the store fell silent, their eyes shifting to Lila. A hot blush flooded Lila's cheeks. She wanted to turn and flee, to hide from the venom in Pearl's voice. But then she thought of the quiet dignity Coulter always wore, the strength in his silence. She lifted her chin. "I am earning a wage, Miss Malloy," Lila said, her voice calm and even, "the same as you." Pearl let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, I am sure you are earning it. A pretty, quiet thing like you. Men like Coulter Graham have a use for quiet things." The insinuation was as ugly as it was unmistakable. Lila felt the stares of the townspeople like a physical weight. She bought her thread and a small bag of horehound candy without another word, her dignity a thin but resilient shield against the woman's cruelty. As she left the store, she could feel Pearl's triumphant gaze on her back. The ride back to the ranch was cold. The sky had turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind had a sharper bite to it, carrying the scent of pine and ice. The peaks of the Bridger Mountains were already dusted with the first snow of the season. The pass leading up to the ranch, a narrow, winding track, was becoming treacherous, slick with patches of frozen mud. Winter was coming, and it was coming fast. The following evening, as Lila worked late in the small office, a knock came at the door. It was not a ranch hand. It was Marshall Pike. He filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light from the kitchen. "Evening, Miss Hart," he said, his smile oily. He stepped inside, letting his eyes roam around the small office before settling on her. "I heard you were lending a hand out here. Very charitable of you. I am being paid for my work." "Marshall," Lila said, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. "Of course you are. he said, moving closer. "A girl has to make her way, which is why I came to see you. The town's winter jubilee is next week. It's an important event. We get important visitors. Men like Mr. Kincaid like to see the town at its best. He was asking after you. He was hoping you would be back at the Sunflower in time to entertain our special guests." The word entertain hung in the air between them, heavy and vile. "My job is to pour drinks, Marshal," Lila said, her voice tight. Pike's smile faded. Red Willow can be a hard place for a young woman on her own. It helps to have powerful friends. It would be a shame if something were to happen, if you were to find yourself without a job or a place to live. A girl needs protection. A word from Mr. Kincaid goes a long way in this town. It would be wise to stay on his good side. It was a threat, delivered with the casual authority of a man who knew his power was absolute. He was telling her to submit, to become the thing Pearl had accused her of being, or face the consequences. When he finally left, Lila sat trembling in the cold, dimming light. She looked at the ledgers on her desk, the honest, messy truth and the elegant, cruel lie. She could not let Kincaid win. She could not let him destroy the Grahams and own this valley. And own her. Taking a blank page from the leather notebook Coulter had given her, she began to work, her quill scratching in the silence, with painstaking care. She copied a single page from the bank's ledger and a corresponding page from Jebediah's records. The 2 columns of figures a stark testament to Kincaid's crime. She folded the page and tucked it deep into the bodice of her dress, the paper a fragile shield against her heart. When Coulter came in from the north pasture, his face chapped by the wind, she was waiting for him. She did not waste words. She laid out the 2 ledgers, her finger tracing the damning discrepancies. He looked at the numbers, his face grim, his silence more profound than any curse. "He is a thief," Lila said softly. "He is more than that," Coulter replied, his voice a low rumble. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a cold, controlled fury. "This is the proof we need. Marshal Pike is in his pocket. We have to go to the county seat in Bozeman." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "In the morning, before he knows what we are doing, I will take you." Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the window pane in its frame. A single, perfect snowflake melted against the dark glass. Then another, and another. The first flakes of the storm began to fall, soft and silent. By nightfall, the world outside was a howling whiteness, and the road to Red Willow, and to Bozeman beyond, had vanished. They left before the first hint of dawn, stepping out into a world of swirling gray chaos. The storm had not waited. It had descended upon the valley with a savage, premature fury. The wind was a living thing with a voice of pure malice, tearing at their clothes and driving the snow into their faces like 1,000 tiny needles. Coulter led the way, his big horse pushing through the rapidly deepening drifts, his own body bent forward, a dark, solid shape against the raging whiteness. Lila followed close behind, her smaller mare struggling to keep pace, the reins slick and frozen in her gloved hands. The world had vanished. There was no road, no trail, only a suffocating vortex of wind and snow. The cold was a physical blow, seeping through the layers of her coat and dress, turning her bones to ice. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. They were not just riding through a storm. They were trying to outrun a monster that was swallowing the world whole. Coulter had not spoken a word since they left the relative shelter of the ranch yard, his entire being focused on the desperate task of navigation. He was reading the land by instinct, by the subtle slope of the ground beneath his horse's hooves, by the shape of the wind as it broke against unseen ridges. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped, holding up a hand. He dismounted, the snow swallowing him to his knees, and came back to her. His face was caked with ice, his eyebrows and mustache white, but his eyes were clear and fiercely alive. "The pass is blocked," he shouted over the shriek of the wind. "We will never make it through. There is a hunter's line shack about a half-mile east of here. We have to try for it." It was not a choice. It was the only chance they had. He took the reins of her horse, and she followed his broad back. A small, shivering vessel in the wake of his relentless forward motion. The shack, when they finally found it, was barely visible. A low, dark shape nearly buried in a deep drift. It was little more than a one-room box of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a heavy plank door, but to Lila, it looked like a cathedral. The horses, their flanks heaving and their coats matted with ice, whinnied in terror and relief as Coulter pushed them into the fragile shelter of a small lean-to attached to the cabin's side. He worked quickly, his frozen fingers clumsy but sure as he rubbed them down with coarse burlap sacks he found inside the cabin, his low voice a constant, calming murmur. Inside, the cold was absolute, a dead, still thing that was somehow worse than the raging chill outside. The single room was tiny, containing a rough wooden bunk, a small stone fireplace, and nothing else. The air smelled of old smoke, damp earth, and the faint, musky scent of animal hides, while Coulter saw to the horses. Lila fumbled with the kindling he had found in a dry box near the hearth. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the flint and steel. Coulter came back inside, shaking the snow from his coat. He saw her struggling and came to kneel beside her without a word. He took the flint and steel from her trembling hands, his own steady and sure. He did not seem to feel the cold. He was a creature of this harsh land, a part of its unforgiving strength. In moments, a tiny spark caught on the tinder, and he nurtured it with a gentle, patient breath, coaxing it into a fragile blossom of orange. Soon, a small, hungry fire was crackling in the hearth, its light and warmth pushing back the predatory dark. The temperature dropped with the last of the daylight. The wind shrieked through the chinks in the log walls, and the roof groaned under the accumulating weight of the snow. They sat on the floor before the small fire, sharing a moth-eaten wool blanket Coulter had found in the bunk. They had not spoken much, the roar of the storm making conversation nearly impossible. The reality of their situation had settled in. They were trapped, utterly isolated, with no way of knowing how long the storm would last. Lila began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. It was not just the cold, it was the fear, the exhaustion, the sudden, overwhelming sense of her own fragility. Coulter looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He reached into his saddlebag, which he had brought in from the lean-to, and pulled out a metal flask. He uncorked it and poured a small amount of the amber liquid into a tin cup. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's howl. "Drink this. It will warm you from the inside." She took the cup, her hands shaking so much the whiskey sloshed against the sides. The tin was cold, but she wrapped her fingers around it, trying to absorb the faint warmth from the liquid inside. She took a small, hesitant sip. The whiskey was a shock of fire in her throat, a raw, burning heat that spread through her chest and into her limbs, chasing away the worst of the chill. Coulter watched her, his gaze soft. He saw her huddled there, her face pale in the firelight, her hands cupped around the tin cup as if it were a prayer. The image struck him with a force that stole his breath. He saw the stark, impossible contrast between this moment and the one that had first drawn him to her. He spoke, his voice quiet, almost a reverie, a thought-given sound. "She poured my whiskey by day, fate led the virgin to share my bed by night." The words fell into the small space between them, as stark and real as the storm outside. Lila froze, the cup held halfway to her lips. She looked at him, her gray eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. The word virgin was not an accusation or a speculation. It was a statement of fact, of her innocence, a recognition of the profound vulnerability of their situation. He was not seeing the saloon girl. He was seeing her, The young woman who hummed lullabies to quell violence, the woman now trapped with him in the heart of a blizzard. A deep flush rose from her neck to her cheeks. She felt exposed, her most private self laid bare by his quiet observation. But in his eyes, she saw no judgment, no avarice. She saw only a deep, abiding respect and a sort of weary wonder, as if he, too, were marveling at the strange, unforeseen path that had led them to this place. He must have seen the fear in her eyes, because he reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the cup from her hands and set it on the floor. "Lila," he said, his voice low and earnest, "you have my word. No harm will come to you here. You are safer with me than you would be in that church back in town. I will guard your honor with my life." His promise was a bedrock in the swirling chaos. She could feel the truth of it in the steady calm of his gaze, in the quiet strength of his presence. She nodded, unable to speak. The shivering finally began to subside, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. The fire was dying down, the small stock of wood nearly gone. The blanket was not enough for them both to sleep separately in the biting cold. Without discussion, a silent understanding passed between them. Survival was all that mattered. Coulter lay down on the hard-packed earth floor, and Lila lay beside him, a careful distance between them. He draped the rough wool blanket over them both. The small space beneath the blanket became a pocket of shared warmth, a sanctuary against the howling fury of the storm. Her world shrank to the small, warm circle of their shared existence. She could hear the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing, feel the solid, reassuring presence of him beside her in the dark. It was an intimacy born not of passion, but of desperation and trust. And in the heart of the storm, sheltered by a single blanket and a solemn promise, she finally closed her eyes and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. The world was silent when she awoke. The wind had died, and a brilliant, blinding light was pouring through the single small window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the memory of the storm, a fading nightmare. Then she felt the heavy weight of the blanket and remembered. Coulter was already awake, sitting by the dead embers of the fire, cleaning his pistol with a small, oiled cloth. He looked up as she stirred, and a faint, tired smile touched his lips. "The storm has broken," he said. They left the cabin an hour later, stepping out into a world transformed. The snow lay in deep, pristine drifts, the sky a painful, brilliant blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in their lungs. After checking on the horses, who were stiff but unharmed, Coulter began to break a trail, leading them back toward the main pass. They had not gone more than 50 yards from the cabin when he stopped dead, his body suddenly rigid. He held up a hand for her to halt. He stared at a point on the ground just ahead. His eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Lila asked, her voice hushed. He did not answer. He dismounted slowly and walked forward, his steps careful. He knelt in the snow. Lila watched, her heart beginning to pound. He reached out and gently brushed away the top layer of fresh powder from between two small pine saplings. There, stretched taut and nearly invisible against the white, was a thin, dark wire, a tripwire. It was positioned at precisely the right height to catch a horse's forelegs, to send both steed and rider crashing to the ground in a tangle of broken bones. It had been set on the only clear path away from the cabin. Had they left in the dark, or in the fury of the storm, they would never have seen it. A chilling realization washed over Lila, colder than the snow she stood in. The storm had been an act of nature, but this was an act of man. Someone had known they would be on this path, and someone had wanted them to fall. Their journey to Bozeman was not just a matter of justice anymore. It had become a matter of survival. The ride back to Red Willow was a journey through a world scrubbed clean and mercilessly bright. The tripwire, once carefully clipped and coiled by Coulter, felt heavier in his saddlebag than a bar of solid iron. It was a tangible piece of the hatred they now faced. As they descended from the pass into the valley, The pristine silence of the high country gave way to the first signs of life. A column of smoke rising from a chimney, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. The town, blanketed in snow, looked peaceful, almost innocent, but it was a deceptive calm. They rode down the main street side by side, and it was as if a silent bell had been rung. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped shoveling paths to lean on their shovels and watch them pass. Conversations on the boardwalk of the general store ceased, the words freezing in the cold air. Lila felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of raw curiosity, pity, and a sharp, gleeful judgment. She and Coulter Graham had disappeared into a blizzard and returned 2 days later, together. The story the town was telling itself was as simple and as ugly as a child's drawing in the dirt. Lila kept her chin high, her eyes fixed on the space between her horse's ears. She could feel the heat of a blush on her cheeks, but she refused to let them see her shame, for she had done nothing shameful. Beside her, Coulter seemed oblivious, his face as impassive and unreadable as a stone. He rode with the same steady, unhurried posture he always did, a man at peace within his own skin, regardless of the world's opinion. At the livery, he dismounted and helped her down, his hand firm and respectful at her elbow. "I will see you are paid for your work at the ranch," he said, his voice low but clear enough for the livery owner to hear. "Thank you for your help, Miss Hart." He was establishing the official nature of their relationship, a small, formal defense against the tide of gossip. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and led their horses into the stable, leaving her alone on the street. The walk to the Sunflower Saloon was the longest of her life. Every step was an act of will. When she pushed open the bat-wing doors, the familiar smell of stale beer and sawdust greeted her. But the atmosphere was different. It was thick with a waiting silence. Mr. Hardin, who was polishing glasses behind the bar, stopped and looked at her, his expression a mixture of relief and deep unease. At a corner table, Pearl Malloy sat with a sly, knowing smile on her painted lips. "Well, the lost lamb returns to the fold," Pearl said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. A few of the daytime drinkers chuckled into their glasses. Lila ignored her. She walked behind the bar, hung her coat on its peg, and tied on her apron. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She would stand her ground on this small patch of worn floorboards that was her own, and she would endure. Coulter did not return to town for 3 days. The whispers about him and Lila swelled to fill the vacuum of his absence. The story grew more elaborate with each telling. A lurid tale of a naive saloon girl and a wealthy rancher. Lila heard snippets of it every day, each one a small, sharp cut. When Coulter did finally ride in, he did not go to the saloon. Instead, he went to the church. The town watched as he unloaded a bundle of new cedar shingles from his wagon. He climbed a ladder to the roof of the small parish kitchen, and for the rest of the day, the sound of his hammer echoed through the quiet, snow-filled streets. He was replacing the shingles that had been torn loose by the storm. Father Merritt came out and spoke with him, and the two men shared a cup of coffee in the cold winter sun. The next day, Coulter loaded his wagon with firewood from the Thatcher Spur and delivered a full cord to the widow Jensen, whose husband had died in a mining accident the year before. He stacked it neatly against her small house, spoke a few quiet words to her on her porch, and then left. He never once mentioned the rumors. He did not have to. His actions spoke a language the town understood better than words. This was a man of substance, a man who cared for his community. He was mending roofs and warming hearths. It was a quiet, powerful declaration of his character. And if a man like that respected Lila Hart, perhaps, the whispers began to concede, there was more to her than met the eye. The reprieve, however, was brief. Kincaid had not been idle. On the fourth day after their return, Marshal Pike, flanked by two grim-faced deputies Lila had never seen before, rode out to the Thatcher Spur. They returned late in the afternoon, driving before them a portion of the Graham herd, the cattle lowing in protest, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The news spread through Red Willow like a contagion. Kincaid had called in the loan. The Grahams were being foreclosed on. The cattle were the first payment on a debt that could never be paid. The seizure was premature. A brutal display of power meant to crush the Grahams and send a message to anyone else who might consider defying the will of the railroad and the bank. That evening, the saloon was tense. Pearl, sensing her moment of triumph, approached Lila at the bar. She placed a hand on Lila's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle, her face a mask of counterfeit sympathy. "Oh, you poor thing," Pearl breathed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It is just terrible what is happening. First, those awful rumors, and now that Coulter Graham dragging you into his mess. You must feel so used." Lila stiffened but did not pull her arm away. "The Grahams are good people," she said, her voice low. "Of course they are," Pearl said soothingly, "but they are finished. Kincaid owns this valley now, and you, my dear, are caught in the middle. He is not a man to cross." She leaned closer. "That little book he gave you, is it a diary? Did you write things down? You must be careful. A woman's private thoughts can be so easily misunderstood." Lila understood at once. Pearl was not offering comfort. She was probing for a weakness. She wanted to know what Lila knew, what she had written in the notebook that had become the subject of so much speculation. "It is just a book for my thoughts, Miss Malloy," Lila said, gently removing her arm from Pearl's grasp. "There is nothing in it that would interest anyone." Pearl's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, the mask of sympathy slipping to reveal the cold ambition beneath. Then she smiled again. "Of course not. Just be careful. Lila, a friend's advice." She turned and glided back to her table, leaving Lila feeling as though a snake had just shed its skin at her feet. The weight of it all pressed down on her: the rumors, the seizure of the cattle, Kincaid's tightening grip, Pearl's venom, and the dangerous secret of the copied ledger page that was still hidden in her room. She felt small and powerless, a single blade of grass against a relentless wind. It was then that the saloon door opened and a small, bundled figure entered, bringing a swirl of fresh, cold air into the stuffy room. It was Anna, the blacksmith's daughter, a girl of about 10 with bright, curious eyes and a stack of the weekly Red Willow Chronicle under her arm. She moved through the tables, selling her papers with a shy determination. When she reached the bar, she looked up at Lila, her gaze direct and free of all the judgment Lila had endured for days. "Miss Hart," Anna asked, her voice clear and high. "Mama says you have the prettiest singing voice in the whole valley." Lila was so taken aback she could only stare. The little girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "There's that song you hum sometimes, the one about the river going home. I try to sing it to my little brother, but I always forget the words in the middle." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I was wondering, if it is not too much trouble, could you write them down for me?" The simple, earnest request was a ray of pure sunlight in a dark and cluttered room. Here was someone who did not see a saloon girl, a subject of gossip, or a pawn in a rich man's game. She saw a singer of songs. She heard the music, not the noise. A slow, genuine smile touched Lila's lips for the first time in days. "I would be honored to, Anna." She took out a pen and a clean scrap of paper from behind the bar, but then she stopped. She looked at the cheap, flimsy paper. The words deserved better. She turned and went to the small back room, returning with the soft leather notebook Coulter had given her. She opened it to a fresh, clean page. With a steady hand, she wrote out the lyrics to the old folk song, her penmanship neat and clear. She tore the page carefully from the book and handed it to the little girl. Anna's face lit up as she read the words. "Thank you. Miss Hart, thank you." She folded the paper with great care and tucked it safely into her coat pocket. She left the saloon with a happy wave, the bell above the door jingling her departure. Lila stood watching the door swing shut, the open notebook still in her hand. The act of sharing something good, something that was hers alone to give, had rekindled a small, warm flame inside her. Kincaid could steal cattle. Pearl could spread lies. The town could whisper and judge. But they could not take her voice. They could not steal her songs. She looked down at the empty space where the page had been, then at the still hidden page with the copied ledger figures. She now held two kinds of truth in her possession, the truth of a simple song and the truth of a complex crime. And in that moment, she knew she could no longer keep silent. The smoldering fire of her quiet resolve was beginning to burn bright. The Red Willow Winter Jubilee was meant to be a celebration, a brief and defiant festival of light against the encroaching darkness of a long Montana winter. Lanterns were strung across the main street, their warm yellow glow casting soft shadows on the deep snow. The town square was filled with people, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they gathered around crackling bonfires, sipping hot cider. There was a sense of fragile community, of shared hardship set aside for a single night of fellowship. Lila Hart had come to the Jubilee not with joy, but with a quiet resolve. She stood near the town's large Christmas tree, a position that offered both a view of the proceedings and the solid, comforting presence of the church at her back. She knew her presence was a statement, a refusal to be driven into the shadows by gossip and innuendo. The townsfolk gave her a wide berth, their glances a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The festive atmosphere curdled when Pearl Malloy, Silas Kincaid at her side, positioned herself at the center of the largest gathering. Kincaid, looking smug and victorious after the seizure of the Graham cattle, acted the part of the town's benefactor. Handing out sweets to the children, Pearl, draped in a fine fur wrap, waited for her moment, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found and fixed upon Lila. Her voice, trained to fill a noisy saloon, cut through the cheerful chatter with practiced ease. She began by saying what a wonderful town Red Willow was, a place where good, decent people could thrive. Then her tone shifted, acquiring a sharp, cruel edge. But even in a good town, she continued, one had to be wary of those who would drag it down. One had to be wary of women with no family, no standing, who used their wiles to attach themselves to good men, poisoning their reputations. Every head turned toward Lila. The accusation was as clear as if her name had been shouted from the church steeple. Pearl's eyes glittered in the firelight. She spoke of how a woman's virtue was her only true currency, and how some spent it so recklessly, spending nights unchaperoned with men of property, hoping to trap them. She finished by saying that some women were like mud. They would cling to a clean boot and stain it forever. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Lila stood frozen, the heat of 100 stares burning her skin. She felt her resolve begin to crack, the old feelings of shame and inadequacy rushing back in. She wanted to run, to disappear into the cold, dark night. Then came the sound of a horse's hooves, slow and deliberate, crunching on the packed snow. The crowd parted. Coulter Graham rode into the center of the square, his face grim, his eyes fixed on Pearl Malloy. He stopped his horse directly in front of her, the animal's breath steaming in the lantern light. He looked down at Pearl, his expression one of cold contempt. Then he let his gaze sweep over the silent, watching faces of the townspeople. Finally, his eyes found Lila, and for a moment, the hardness in his face softened. His voice cut through the murmuring crowd. Clear and hard as winter ice, he declared that he would rather marry a woman who knows how to feed others with quiet hands than one who only knows how to swallow flattery. The statement was a thunderclap in the frozen air. It was not just a defense, it was a declaration. He had not only shielded Lila's honor, he had claimed it as his own. Pearl's face, in the flickering light, was a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. Silas Kincaid's smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. Before anyone could react, Coulter dismounted, walked to Lila's side, and gently took her arm. He said softly, for her alone to hear, "It is time." The next morning, the small county courtroom was packed. The news of the Jubilee confrontation and of the formal hearing Coulter had demanded had spread like wildfire. Circuit Judge Morrison, a stern, fair man from Bozeman, presided. Kincaid sat with his lawyer, looking confident, while Marshal Pike stood near the door, a symbol of the established order. Coulter's lawyer presented their case, alleging financial misconduct. Kincaid's lawyer laughed it off, calling it the desperate slander of a failed rancher. He demanded proof. Coulter nodded to Lila. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked to the front of the courtroom. Her hands trembled as she presented the single, folded page to the judge. It was the copy she had made, showing the two sets of numbers, Jebediah's honest accounting and the bank's fraudulent one. The judge studied the paper, his brow furrowed. He looked at Kincaid. Kincaid scoffed, saying it was a pathetic forgery, a girl's scribbles. He said who would believe the word of a saloon girl against the formal records of a bank. The judge looked back at the document. He then called for the chief clerk of the railroad depot, a nervous, balding man named Thomas Finch, to come forward. Finch had been subpoenaed at Coulter's request. He had been the one who signed for the deliveries. Finch took the stand, his face pale, his hands twisting a worn hat. The judge showed him the paper. He asked him which set of numbers was the truth. Finch looked at Kincaid, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He looked at Marshal Pike, whose hand was resting on the butt of his pistol. Then he looked at Lila, standing straight and tall, her face pale but her eyes steady. He saw her courage, and in it, he found a flicker of his own. He took a shaky breath. His voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. He said that the smaller numbers were the correct ones. He confessed that for months. Mr. Kincaid had forced him to sign falsified manifests, threatening his job and his family if he refused. He had been given a small share of the profits, a few dollars of hush money that had sat like a stone in his gut. The confession broke the dam. Kincaid leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting that it was all lies, but the judge's sharp command for order cut him off. The carefully constructed facade of Silas Kincaid had shattered, revealing the greedy, ruthless man beneath. Judge Morrison looked at Marshal Pike with disgust. He announced that he was temporarily suspending the marshal from his duties, pending a federal investigation into corruption and fraud in Red Willow. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a stunning, unthinkable victory. For a moment, there was a sense of pure, unadulterated justice. Then, a man burst through the courtroom doors, his face smudged with soot, his eyes wide with panic. He shouted one word, "Fire!" Smoke was visible through the courthouse windows, a thick black pillar rising into the clear winter sky from the direction of the Thatcher Spur. It was a desperate, vicious act of retaliation. Kincaid's men, seeing their power crumble, had tried to create a diversion, to pull the men of the town away, to destroy what they could not steal. The courtroom emptied in a rush of chaotic urgency. The men ran for their horses, shouting for buckets. Coulter was among the first out, his face a mask of grim determination as he leaped into his saddle. But as the men charged out of town, a different kind of army began to form. Lila stood on the courthouse steps, watching the column of smoke. The women of the town stood clustered together, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty, their children clinging to their skirts. They were accustomed to waiting, to praying while the men did the fighting. Lila looked at their faces, and then at the town well. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She was no longer just the woman who had been defended. She was a woman who would defend. She raised her voice, clear and strong, cutting through the panicked murmurs. She called out that the men could not do it alone. The fire would not wait. They had buckets. They had hands. They could help. For a moment, no one moved. Then the blacksmith's wife, Anna's mother, stepped forward. Then the widow Jensen. Then another, and another. A silent, powerful current passed through the women of Red Willow. They were not just wives and mothers. They were a community. Lila organized them with a calm efficiency she did not know she possessed. A human chain formed, stretching from the well to the edge of town where wagons were being hastily loaded. Buckets of water were passed from hand to hand, a rhythmic, desperate effort against time. Lila worked alongside them, her arms aching, her dress soaked with icy water, her voice a constant encouragement. When they reached the Thatcher Spur, the scene was hellish. The large hay barn was engulfed in flames. A roaring orange furnace that threatened to spread to the main house and stables. Coulter and the ranch hands were fighting the blaze with a desperate courage, their faces black with soot, their efforts seeming futile against the inferno. The arrival of the women and their wagons of water turned the tide. The two lines of battle, one of men, one of women, merged into a single, unified force. They were no longer the gossips and the judged, the powerful and the powerless. They were simply people, fighting together to save a neighbor. Lila and Coulter worked in sight of each other, not speaking, but connected by a shared purpose that was stronger than any spoken word. They were a community, finally and truly, their individual strengths forged into a single weapon against the destructive fire of greed and hate. They were pulling together to save not just a barn, but the very soul of their town. The fire died as the sun rose, leaving the great hay barn a blackened skeleton against the pale pink dawn. The air, sharp and cold, was thick with the smell of wet ash and scorched pine. The people of Red Willow, men and women together, stood in weary, soot-stained clusters, their face drawn with exhaustion but lit with a new, unfamiliar sense of shared victory. They had not just saved a ranch, they had saved themselves from the slow poison of fear and division. In the days that followed, a different kind of cleansing began. 2 federal marshals, quiet men with hard eyes and an authority that owed nothing to local politics, arrived from Bozeman. They spent a day asking questions, their presence a stark contrast to the blustering authority of Marshal Pike. Silas Kincaid was taken into custody, his fine city suit rumpled, his face a mask of disbelief that his web of money and influence could be so thoroughly undone. He was escorted out of town in a simple buggy, no longer a predator, but a common criminal. Marshal Pike did not wait for a formal dismissal. He was simply gone one morning, his office empty, his presence in the town erased as if he had been a bad dream. Pearl Malloy's downfall was quieter, but no less complete. Without Kincaid's patronage, she was just a singer in a saloon that was suddenly and conspicuously empty whenever she took the stage. The power of her venom had been neutralized by the town's newfound respect for Lila. Her cruel words, once so effective, now fell into a deep, dismissive silence. The women who had once feared her now simply ignored her, their quiet solidarity, a wall she could not breach. The change in how the town saw Lila was a palpable thing. It was not spoken of, but it was there in the small, everyday gestures. The blacksmith's wife would nod and smile as Lila passed. Mr. Harding from the general store would save the freshest eggs for her. The women she had organized into the bucket brigade now greeted her as one of their own, an equal, a leader. They had seen her courage, not just in the courtroom, but in the face of the fire, and it had earned her a place she had never sought but had profoundly won. One afternoon, Lila walked into the Sunflower Saloon and untied her apron for the last time. She told Mr. Hardin she was leaving. He was a tired old man, caught in a tide too strong for him, and he only nodded, his eyes full of a weary understanding. Her time of pouring whiskey was over. Coulter did not speak of the future, not with words. He spoke with the rhythmic, percussive language of an axe biting into pine. On a small, sheltered piece of land on the Thatcher Spur, where a clear, cold stream tumbled over smooth stones, he began to build. He felled the trees himself, his movements economical and powerful. He notched the logs with a patient, practiced skill, raising the walls of a small, sturdy cabin, one by one. Lila would walk out to the site in the afternoons, bringing him a canteen of fresh water and a piece of bread and cheese. They rarely spoke of what he was building. They did not need to. She would watch him work, the late afternoon sun turning the fresh wood chips to gold. He was not just building a house. He was building a foundation, a shelter, a promise. His silence was filled with a devotion more eloquent than any poem. When the cabin was finished, its single room smelling of pine and clean earth, he did not stop. He found a massive ponderosa pine that had been felled by the storm and, over the course of a week, began to hew it into a single, massive plank. From this, he built a table. It was a long, simple, beautiful thing, sturdy enough to last 100 years. It was a table built not for 2 people, but for 20. It was a statement of welcome, an invitation to a community. When it was done, he stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked at Lila, who had been watching him, and a rare, slow smile touched his lips. He said that a table like this needed a good cook. It was the closest he came to a proposal, and to Lila, it was more beautiful than any diamond ring. They moved the table into the small cabin, where it filled the main room with its solid, generous presence, and there, with the help of a few women from the town, Lila opened the Red Willow table. It was not a restaurant or an inn. It was a place of warmth in a cold land. Every day, a single large pot of rich, savory stew simmered on the hearth, and a fresh batch of golden cornbread sat cooling on the sideboard. A clay jar filled with the small, resilient wild daisies that grew by the stream always sat in the middle of the long table. There was no set price. A jar sat on the mantelpiece, and people put in what they could afford. The lonely ranch hand, the weary traveler, the widow Jensen with her children, all found a place at the table. It became the new heart of the town, a place where news was shared, where comfort was given, where no one had to eat alone. It was a kitchen, a gathering hall, and a sanctuary, all in one. One afternoon, Coulter brought her a new leather-bound book, almost identical to the first one he had given her. It was empty. Together, they placed it on a small lectern he had built near the door. On the first page, Lila wrote in her clear, simple script, a single sentence: "All are welcome at this table." It became a custom. Anyone who shared a meal at the Red Willow table was invited to write in the book a line from a song, a simple word of thanks, a prayer, a piece of news from a faraway home. Young Anna, the blacksmith's daughter, carefully copied the words to the river lullaby Lila had once written for her. Thomas Finch, the railroad clerk who was now working at the livery stable, wrote that a man is never too old to learn to walk a straight path. The pages began to fill, a chronicle of the small, interwoven lives of Red Willow. It was a testament not to a single person's voice, but to the quiet, resilient voice of a community that had been tested by fire and had chosen to rebuild, together, around a single, long table. The harshness of the Montana winter slowly loosened its grip, its retreat a messy, protracted affair. The deep snow melted under a strengthening sun, turning the valley into a patchwork of white and muddy brown. The air, for so long sharp and sterile, began to smell of damp earth and the promise of new growth. The creek beside the small cabin, freed from its prison of ice, once again spoke its endless, tumbling language. Spring was not a gentle arrival. It was a hard-won victory. The Red Willow table had become the town's living room. Its long, scarred surface was a map of the community's slow healing. Every day it was filled with the steam of hot stew, the warmth of fresh bread, and the low, steady murmur of conversation. Lila and Coulter worked in a quiet, practiced rhythm, their partnership as solid and unassuming as the cabin walls. She was the heart of the hearth. He was the quiet strength that kept the woodpile high and the structure sound. They were two parts of a single, functioning whole. One afternoon, a rider from the stage line brought a small bundle of mail, a rare luxury. In it was a letter addressed to Lila, in the careful, looping script of a child. It was from Anna, the blacksmith's daughter. Her family had moved on, following the promise of a better wage in a larger town downstream. Lila's heart felt a small pang of loss, the inevitable sorrow of seeing a bright piece of her world move beyond her reach. She sat on the cabin's porch to read it, the new spring sun warm on her shoulders. Anna wrote of the new town, of its size and its noise, of how small she felt within it. She wrote of the school she attended, and of the other children. Then, near the bottom of the page, she asked the question that had clearly prompted the letter, a question that was a world away from the simple request for lyrics she had made months before. She wrote, "I still sing the river song you gave me, but it is so loud here. No one seems to listen. Mama says I should spend more time on my sums, because sums are useful. Is singing useful, Miss Hart, or is it just a silly thing for a little girl?" The words pierced Lila's heart with a gentle, aching precision. She saw herself in the girl's question, the reflection of her own long-held fears. She remembered the feeling of her own voice being nothing more than a hum against the loud, coarse backdrop of the saloon, a thing of no consequence. She folded the letter, the child's uncertain words a perfect echo of her own past. She did not answer right away. For a day, she carried the question with her as she kneaded bread, stirred the stew, and tended the small herb garden she had planted behind the cabin. She thought of the journey she had taken, from a girl who hummed to quiet her fears, to a woman who had found the courage to speak the truth in a silent courtroom. Her voice had been useful. It had been a weapon, a comfort, and a shield. That evening, after the last of the day's visitors had departed, leaving the long table empty and the cabin filled with a peaceful quiet, she sat down with the community book. She looked at the pages filled with the varied handwriting of her neighbors, a tapestry of their thoughts and thanks. She took out a fresh sheet of paper, dipped her pen in the inkwell, and began to write. She wrote, "My dearest Anna, there is nothing in this world more useful than a song. A sum can tell you how much you have, but a song can tell you who you are. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your voice is a silly thing. It is the most important thing you will ever own." She paused, thinking of Coulter's quiet faith in her, of the small, anonymous note left on a dusty windowsill. She continued, a new certainty flowing through her pen. "Sing for yourself first, Anna. Sing because it makes your own heart feel full. The people who are meant to hear it, the ones who are truly worthy of your song, they will stop and listen. The rest of the world's noise does not matter." A month later, the valley was green. The harsh memory of the winter had softened, and the days were long and warm. One evening, Lila and Coulter sat together on the porch of the cabin he had built, their chairs close, their shoulders occasionally touching. The day's work was done. The long table inside was clean, ready for the morning. The sound of the creek was a constant, soothing murmur. In the vast distance, a train whistle blew. It was a faint, lonely sound. No longer the menacing cry of an encroaching empire, but simply a sound in a wide, peaceful landscape. It spoke of a world beyond their valley, a world that would continue to change, but it no longer held any power over them. They sat in the comfortable silence that was the foundation of their life together. It was a silence built of trust and a deep, unspoken understanding. Finally, Coulter spoke, his voice a low, warm rumble in the twilight. It was a night like this, he said, his gaze on the darkening mountains. Cold, though colder than I have ever been. Lila knew at once the night he meant. I thought the wind would tear the cabin apart, she said softly. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of the memory. A slow smile touched his lips, a smile of wonder at the strange and difficult path that had led them here. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He said the words softly, not as a whisper of scandal, but as the first line of their own private history. She poured my whiskey by day. Lila's heart filled with a quiet, profound joy. She looked into his eyes and finished the line, her voice steady and clear, reclaiming the words from the world of whispers and making them their own. The words were no longer a rumor to be endured, but a cherished memory of the moment that fate had bound their lives together. The future remained an unwritten page. The Montana land was still a hard master. There would be other droughts, other blizzards, other struggles that would test their strength and their spirits. But as they sat together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the first stars appear in the vast, darkening sky, they knew they would face it together. The fire in their hearth was burning brightly, and the long table inside would always have room for one more. In a harsh and unforgiving West, they had built a small, enduring pocket of warmth, of community, and of justice. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and press the hype button to help share it with more listeners.